Hey everyone. We'll get started. Hey everyone. This is your PMRF live session 11 for the course NPTEL course, I think biology. And I am Arpit. I am your TA from Indian Institute of Science. And today we'll go over lectures from week 11. So here are some important links before we begin, as always. So first we have the live session link, which is the link to this live session. Then we have the YouTube link, which is the link to the channel containing all the videos, recordings of these live sessions, and the Google Drive link, where basically all these PowerPoints will be updated. So today we'll start with biology and climate change. So out of 4 lectures in this week, 3 lectures covered biology and climate change. Uh, so you must understand how much important of a subject it is. But uh, basically, to delve more into that, we'll go through all these 3 lectures together. Uh, sorry. And then at the end, we move on to biodiversity conservation. Right. So basically, climate change is a very, uh, what do you say, uh, important ongoing crisis that affects a lot of spheres of life, and including it affects our human population and other things in our planet such as a lot, right? So basically, climate change can be thought of as a process that basically regulates the stability or the resilience of the system, right? If it's very hot, then it's not very stable. If it's very cold, it's not very stable. It needs to be at some moderate uh, state, right? So similarly, in 2009, these people defined put forward this theory of something called planetary boundary, which basically talks about 9 different processes from the Earth that regulate the stability and the resilience of the Earth as a system. Right. So, I'm sorry. So the first thing, as we were talking about, is climate change, which has a huge effect on. Sorry. First, we are talking about climate change, which has a huge effect on basically the Earth. Then we talk about stratospheric ozone depletion. So basically, as we know, we have a ozone layer, which is covering the Earth. So basically, depletion of that ozone layer leads to basically harmful UV rays to penetrate the atmosphere, right? Uh, So basically, ozone layer depletion, that's another of these process, basically which regulates the stability and resilience of our system. Then atmospheric aerosol loading. So how much of aerosol we are basically loading onto the atmosphere, how much we are basically leaving, putting it out there, right? Then ocean acidification, which basically leads to lot of things like destruction of cells of animals and coral damage and things like that. Then biochemical flow. So basically, these are nutrient cycles and basically the rates of nutrient cycles. Uh, if the carbon, basically nutrient sinks are changing or evolving, if the nutrient sources are changing or evolving, and so on and so forth. Then you have freshwater use, how much fresh water is being used. Then you have land system change, which basically tells you, for example, this area used to be a forest before, but now it's a residential area, let's say. So that thing, sorry. So basically, land system change, and then something called biosphere integrity. which basically includes a lot of ecological things. And basically, there are some novel entities which have not been quantified yet, but these are broadly the 9 processes that regulate the stability and resilience of the system. And basically, so they can be divided into these things. Broadly 3 categories. So there are the 3 big ones, which are making a lot of, which are affecting the Earth in a pretty big way. The first is climate change, which leads to warming of the globe, increase in temperature, and yeah, more frequency of natural calamities and so on and so forth. And then ocean acidification, as we talked about before, and ozone layer destruction, right? Then basically under the hood are basically things that support life on Earth. Right. So the first 3 big ones are things that can drastically affect life on Earth. The rest are basically under the hood, as in these are things that support life on Earth. So, like, if there's a change in the biodiversity, if there are very few species, the survival of life on Earth would be very difficult, right? Then freshwater use, how much of the water we are using, land use, land system change, and basically all these different carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus cycles, right? So they basically support life on Earth, and basically that's why these are known as basically under the hood uh, processes. And then we have chemical loading, which is basically aerosols and other novel entities that are basically we are loading onto the environment. Right? For example, aerosols we are releasing out into the atmosphere. So for each of these Earth system process, what these authors did is basically they had different things that they measured. So different parameters that they used as proxies to basically um, look at these Earth system processes. And basically they proposed a boundary. So in this graph, what is being shown here is basically the green part is where it's below the boundary. So the it's well and good in its operating range. There's no issue there. If it goes beyond that into the second layer, then basically it's in the zone of uncertainty where you don't know whether how the Earth is going to respond to it, right? Or what is going to happen. And then if you move further, you get to the red part, which is basically beyond the zone of uncertainty. So now there's a very high risk that this uh, Earth has changed in this regard, and it will be very difficult for us to predict what is going to happen, right, or deal with it, right? So yeah, uh, basically these people what they did is basically they thought of parameters and they basically proposed boundaries of how much is safe to use. And then what is shown here is the basically the proposed boundary, then the current status. So what is the value currently, and basically the pre-industrial value. So what was the value before industrial revolution? So that is generally seen as a benchmark of all these climate change and anthropogenic impacts, because basically uh, before industrialization there was little to no impact of humans on the earth as a whole, but now after that it has increased quite a lot, right? So therefore pre-industrial value is often taken as the um, uh, baseline, right, in many cases. So basically, let's go over the 3 big ones first. So when we look at climate change, so we can measure basically atmospheric carbon dioxide that is present in the atmosphere. So basically parts per million by volume. And then you have the anthropogenic radiative forcing at top of the atmosphere. So basically how much, uh, what do you say? Because of anthropogenic activity, how much more heat is getting trapped, right? How much more that radiative forcing or the effect of all of these things are, right? So the proposed boundary for these two are respectively 350 and 1. However, the current status is quite high, which is 417 and 2.91 compared to the proposed boundary. And we can see the pre-industrial values were basically well within the proposed boundary, right? So these are like aspects in which we need to change and improve. So basically, mostly due to greenhouse gas effect and other things, where basically it is leading to a higher atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration and higher anthropogenic radiative force, right? Then you have ocean acidification, where basically uh, the parameter that they use is global mean saturation state of aragonite in seawater, right? So basically, the proposed boundary here is 2.75. The current status is almost close to that, which is 2.99. However, the value beyond before industrial evolution was quite high, right? Then you have the ozone layer, where basically the concentration of ozone is measured as a parameter. So the proposed boundary is 276, the current status is 283, and pre-industrial value is 290. So this is one of the cases where basically we have actively tried to basically prevent the ozone layer destruction from happening in our lifetimes, and therefore you see that before industrial uh, the industrial value was higher, and then once we realized that this is happening, we tried to stop it. We tried to increase the ozone layer or let it refill. So basically, that increased the concentration of ozone again, right, into safe level, into almost safe level. Then for the processes of life on Earth, we have basically to measure biodiversity uh, or to parameterize biodiversity. What we use is basically extinction rate or the number of species per million species per year that are going extinct. So the proposed boundary for this is 10. Pre-industrial value was 0.1 to 1. So that means 1 or 10 basically species, what do you say, got extinct, right? Per million species per year, right? So the proposed boundary is 10, but the current status is quite higher than 100, right? Then global freshwater use. So this is consumption of freshwater by humans in kilometer square, kilometer cube per year. Hmm, sorry. So here we see that it's well within the current status, proposed boundary. The current status is well within the proposed boundary, but it is quite high compared to the pre-industrial value. So we need to plan carefully and manage and tackle this thing better. Biodiversity needs very high, what do you say? Sorry, very high amount of adaptation or mitigation strategies to basically deal with. But freshwater use, we can plan from now on and make it better, right? Then land system change, which is basically area of forested land as a percentage of original forest cover. So here, original forest cover is the one taken up as pre-industrial value. So it has a value of 100, and currently the status is 60. So the proposed boundary is 75. So we need to have more amount of forest all across the globe that can help support light better. Then basically for the different floors, which is nitrogen and phosphorus cycle. So the amount of nitrogen removed from the atmosphere for human use and the quality of phosphorus flowing into the ocean. Right. So these are the two things that are quantified, and we see that we are within the boundary in the case of quality of phosphorus, but for nitrogen, we are basically using a lot more nitrogen than we are supposed to. Right. So most of this nitrogen goes into things like fertilizers and other such things. Right. Hmm. The last one was chemical loading. So here the processes that we talked about are aerosol and novel entities or chemical pollution. So aerosol, in the case of aerosol, what they measure is overall particulate concentration in the atmosphere. So and for novel entities, but they have this concentration of persistent pollutants, plastic, endocrine disruptors, and heavy metals and nuclear waste, and so on and so forth. Right. And so the thing is, these things are not quantified very properly because these are very local phenomena, right? So the concentrations and the values vary a lot locally, and therefore um, these things, the proposed boundary and how we should deal with it, should be determined on a regional basis, right? So this is what they show. So in 2009, when this boundaries framework was planetary boundaries framework was proposed, basically we had crossed almost three boundaries, right? In 2015, we crossed the fourth one, and in 2023, which is the most recent, we have crossed around six boundaries. Right. So life on Earth is uh, not exactly on the verge of collapse, but basically it's going towards it, right? Because all of these things are slowly and slowly getting crossed. So what people propose is basically safe and just Earth system boundaries. So basically these are uh, basically they have projected that this is how much we need to basically survive right now and grow sustainably without affecting the uh, uh, earth as a whole. So basically, the safe boundaries are shown here, and basically, the black ones are where the boundaries currently are. So basically, the boundaries need to decrease, and basically, we'll be able to achieve it, is what they said. Right. The other framework of thinking about all these things is basically the what do you call Sustainable Development Goals. So these are basically goals proposed by the UN and ratified by many countries, which basically is tells us about where um, we should head as a species, how do you say, as a civilization. Basically, what all should we be providing everywhere and how it needs to be done, and so on and so forth. For example, they say that the broad focus should be on basically maintaining the biosphere, followed by basically. Uh, so here, in the case of biosphere, you have things such as life below water, life on land, and basically these kinds of things. And then you again have clean water and sanitation, and you have climate action, right? And then we need to focus on societal issues. So things basically like no poverty, zero hunger, good health, and well-being, and so on and so forth. So all these things, and then we look at basically the economy of it. And so we have sustainable development goals in terms of economy also, for example, decent work and economic growth for everyone, then industry, innovation and infrastructure, and then responsible consumption and production. Right. So this is not exactly looking at economic um, benefits and costs, but rather it's looking at economy through the sense of a biosphere first, right? So sustainable development, sustainable economy. So basically, um, how can we get money without basically damaging the earth more? Okay. So these are in total all the 17 sustainable development goals that have been laid out. So yeah, that was it for the first lecture. Then in the second lecture, so basically this is from a very old magazine where they basically had published a newspaper where they basically publish the effect of coal consumption, how coal consumption is affecting the climate. Basically, they say that the furnaces of the world are now burning out 2 trillion tons of coal a year, right? 2 billion tons of coal a year. When this is burned, uniting with oxygen, it adds about 7 billion tons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere yearly. Right, 7 billion tons. This tends to make the air a more effective blanket for the Earth and to raise its temperature. This effect may be considerable in a few centuries. So this is one of the first mentions of basically how things affect the climate, right? Then the other thing is when we are talking about things like climate change and global warming, often people uh, use them interchangeably, but there are certain differences between both the terms. So for the purpose of the course, here is how we'll be defining both of them. So global warming refers to the rise in global temperature due mainly to the increasing concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, right? So we know basically that there are some gases which basically act as greenhouse gases. So basically, what they do is when basically the sun is putting light on Earth, putting the energy on Earth, solar radiation is coming to the Earth. What is happening is some of it is reflected by the atmosphere, some of it comes to the Earth's surface and gets reflected, and some radiation is absorbed by the Earth's surface, right? So we have these three things. Some of it is coming and going here, some of it is coming and going here, and some of it is going and getting absorbed here. Now, at night, what happens when there's no sun? What happens is this in radiation, basically from the earth, tries to go out. And what happens is some of it goes out of the atmosphere, some of it basically comes back, right? Some of it is absorbed by the greenhouse gases that are present in the atmosphere and then re-emitted again, right? This basically leads to warming of the Earth's atmosphere and warming of the Earth's surface even at night. Right? So increasing amounts of warming. So this is basically the greenhouse effect, greenhouse effect. So global warming basically refers to the rise in temperatures across the globe due to mainly the greenhouse effect and basically more release of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Right. Climate change, however, refers to the increasing changes in the measures of climate over a long period of time, including precipitation, temperature, and wind patterns. So, when we are talking about climate change, what we are referring to is not basically just the temperature, but a lot of different things. For example, climate change includes global warming because it also looks at how the temperature is changing across years, how the precipitation is changing across years in a given area, in a larger area, how the wind patterns are changing across the globe. And so those kinds of things are looked at by climate change. So basically, yeah, uh, in a stable climate system, what should happen is there should be some solar energy that is coming in, some that is going out, escaping or radiating back. So what is happening in a stable climate is there should be some amount coming, some amount going out. So today what is happening is it's getting imbalanced. So what is happening is most of it, so it's coming the same, but it's not everything is going out. Less outgoing energy is present due to increase in greenhouse gases. And what happens is excess of this energy, it is mostly accumulating in the oceans, right? And then basically it's affecting the ice, the land, and the atmosphere also, right? So these are basically uh, changes in global surface temperature from 1850 to 1900, right? In the first graph here, we can see basically that uh, what do you see? Uh, yeah, in the first graph, we can see that the uh, temperature change is not that high. It's very close to zero because it's starting from like 1900s before that. So basically, what happens here is after a while, there's a dip, right around the 1500. There's a dip, which is called the mini ice age. Then what happens is from this period of 1850 to 2020, there's a high rise in the observed temperature of the globe. Right. So there's unprecedented warming in more than 2000 years. So in 2000 years, this has not happened, but it has happened in the span of these 150 years, 150, 200 years. Right. So now, if you look at a zoomed in portion of 1850 to 2020, we see that if we simulate basically human activity and simulate a globe with human activity and without human activity, right? Only natural activity, we see that basically the pattern that is observed for the graph, the way it goes up, it should go up that way if we are simulating human and natural factors, but it should not go up that high if we are simulating only natural factors, right? So therefore, what this tells us is basically because of us, this increase in temperature has been happening across the globe. So yeah, so basically these are graphs from what is called the IPCC, right? So um, basically this is a what do you say? Um, group that basically uh, what do you say, intergovernmental panel on climate change. So basically, these are like representatives from all across the world in different governments and all. Will basically talk about climate change and basically how it's affecting, what is happening, and so on and so forth. Right. So they have certain scenarios. So these scenarios are called SSPs. So these are basically how we develop in the future. Do we still continue using non-renewable sources of energy, for example, or do we change into renewable sources of energy? Do we use less fresh water, more fresh water, things like that? So basically, what they're doing is they are simulating all these different scenarios and how things will look like under these different scenarios. Right. So they had the data for global surface temperature change from 1850s relative to 1850 to 1900. So they have that data from 1950 to 2015. And what they're doing is basically at the point of 2015, they're basically simulating for the future. So these are different categories of simulation. These are different SSPs are different goals that we are going about. And basically, it tells us how the surface temperature might change more or less depending on what strategy we use. Right. Similarly, they show that for ocean acidification, which is increasing the decreasing the pH of the ocean and making it more acidic. So basically, how that will also progress, and we see here that basically that the Huh. So basically, again, in the next one, we are seeing the global mean sea level, right? How it is changing. Then we have the other graphs also, which basically show us how the temperature has changed in the last 50 years. So the average temperature across the globe from 2011 to 2021 versus 1956 to 1976, which is used as baseline. Here you can see that most areas across the globe and more so the land masses have gotten more and more hotter, and especially the northern regions, so these Arctic regions and all have gotten very hot compared to other regions. But everything as a whole is mostly getting hotter and hotter. Right. So yeah, basically this IPCC, they basically have uh, what do you say, these reports that they're basically preparing, and basically this is how they do it. Basically how they assess things. Right. So basically, they use multiple lines of evidence, for example, paleo records. So how was the temperature and all long ago? Then using satellites to have satellite imagery, then Argo floats, which basically float on water and all that. And basically, then they simulate all these things and they try to predict things. Right. So these are again basically measurements of atmospheric carbon dioxide since 1958 that are taken in the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. Right. So here you basically see that the amount of carbon dioxide since 1958 has been constantly increasing. Right. And if you basically now expand the range. So instead of looking at basically 1958 to 2016, if we try to look at, let's say, in the past 1,000 years, from 1,000, what is happening, you see that uh, this basically uh, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was quite low for a very long time. And around the 1800s, 1850s, it started increasing along with industrial revolution. And we see that in the past few years, it has increased quite a lot. It's also predicted to be increasing more. Then what we have here is basically again the temperature. Sorry, so how the temperature has been increasing all across the globe, right, because of climate change. Then basically, uh, so yeah, so here basically what we have is uh, so so basically what we have here is basically observed warming. So what is the warming that is observed all across the world? Mm. And basically, then they have used two different kinds of methods to basically look at many different things that can be addressed to this cooling or warming. For example, carbon dioxide is linked with the warming because there has been an increase in the number of in the amount of uh, carbon dioxide here, right? And then we have methane and so on and so forth. We have some things like sulfur dioxide and basically organic carbon, which basically decrease the temperature, but and positively affect the global warming, like by preventing global warming. But like what we see overall is the observed warming is higher, right? Because there's a lot of things that are basically negative, right? And what they were able to identify in this is basically that human influence or human activity, human emission of these greenhouse gases and other things basically what do you say, were partly masked by this cooling provided due to different aerosols that we release, right? But the thing is, these might be things that are happening on a local or regional scale because the aerosol concentration, as we talked about earlier, it varies quite a lot, right? So next we have basically again how what things affect the radiative forcing, right? Uh, Radiative forcing is what per meter square. So how much amount of energy is incident per meter square, right? Mm, at some given time. So basically, what is happening here is we have these greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide, into methane, and others, ozone basically, and we see how basically they affect the temperature. So we see that carbon dioxide increases the temperature by increasing the radiative forcing, right? Similarly, these halocarbons and other greenhouse gases also increase. Then ozone that is present in the troposphere increases the temperature, radiative forcing, sorry. And then things like aerosols. So the directly and indirectly they have effects which basically lead to cooling or less radiative forcing. Right, but the overall uh, average or the overall combination or interaction that we get from all of these is that there's a lot of mm, heating up of the atmosphere. Right. Then here we see how the annual carbon dioxide emissions have been increasing in the world across the past few years. You see that from 1850s to 1950 and like in the last 10, 20 years, it has been increasing quite a lot. Then basically most of it can be attributed to fossil fuel, as we see in the next graph, and some of it to land use change, which is decreasing. Right. Then this is a comparison of basically current and historically which countries emit the most carbon dioxide, and basically historically who has contributed most to carbon dioxide, global carbon dioxide emissions, right? So what is basically happening here is when we try to form an agency like United Nations or something, or we try to have this IPCC, and we basically have the what do you say meeting of IPCC, right? All these climate bodies and so on. So what happens is basically uh, to rectify these climate things, we also need to understand who has played a bigger part in it. So maybe they should be more pressed for retribution, correct? So whoever emits the most should basically have to remit most of the resources to basically go back, right? So so there are two things. One thing is who emits the most carbon dioxide currently, and the second thing is who has contributed to it more significantly across a longer period of time. So what we see is basically that currently Asia contributes a lot of global emissions. So around 27% is present in China, and basically 6.8% from India, and so a total of 53% of global emissions from other countries, such as these, have led to Asia producing the most amount of carbon dioxide, followed by North America, where USA contributes to around 15% of global emissions, right? And then Europe, where the U28 has 9.8% global emission. But if we look at the same thing, so we would think that maybe China, India, and all these countries are what emitting most amount of carbon dioxide, so they should be putting in more steps, putting in more effort to basically deal with these climate crisis, right? But if you look at who has contributed most to global carbon dioxide emissions, you can see that here clearly the changes, and basically 29% of the global cumulative is from North America, where 25% is basically by USA, compared to 22% for EU28, and other places such as India and China are now respectively at 3% and 12.7%, which is quite low, right, compared to other countries. So what do we do, right? How do we deal with things? So these are the kinds of things that they think about as they come across, right? Then what we have here is again the share of global carbon dioxide emissions. So how much carbon dioxide is emitted globally? Uh, Right, from the fossil fuels and from other industries. We see that this is divided across according to the countries broadly. We see that United Kingdom has around 100% in of the global emission in 1750, and then it drops down significantly. Initially, it was 100% there because that's where most of these industrial revolution in heavy machinery and things started operating. So basically, that then decreased slowly over the years, and other places also follow trend. And now we see that China, India are slightly increasing currently, whereas other places such as USA and what can I say? Yeah, USA and basically UK and all are decreasing, right? But we see 1889 is basically where the USA took over UK, and USA was growing, whereas UK was still decreasing. Right. So the United States has emitted more carbon dioxide than any other country to date, at around 400 billion tons since 1751. It is responsible for 25% of historical emissions. The 28 countries of the European Union, EU28, also have a large historical contributor at 22%. Many of the large annual emitters today, such as India, Brazil, and China, are not so large contributors in historical context. Right. This is a wonderful video that you can go and watch, which basically talks about who should be responsible for climate change, how do we deal with it, who puts in more measures, and so on and so forth. Right. So then basically, uh, what we can also do is, again, when we are looking at it, we can look at basically carbon emissions per capita. Right. So per capita is basically divided by the population. Right. So because total amount of carbon emissions might be quite high, but it might be high because there are more people living in a given area, right? And so therefore emissions per capita is a better way to look at it. So what happens is we see once we look at this look at it this way, we see that uh, US now has very high carbon emissions per capita, whereas China, which had very high value, cumulative value, now seems like not so high because the per capita emission is quite less. Right, right. Then basically this is another graph which basically shows annual global carbon dioxide emissions, how much is emitted per year, right across the years. And we see that till 1990, which is like, let's say 30 years from now, 30 years before, approximately 30 years before, from since then to here, we have emitted around 831 gigatons of carbon dioxide, whereas we emitted only uh, 784 gigatons of carbon dioxide from 1750s to 1990s. Right. So the amount of carbon dioxide that we emitted in the past 30 years is half of the total amount of carbon dioxide that we ever emitted after the Industrial Revolution. Right. So that's quite a big thing. Yeah, it's almost equal, half of it. Yeah. So uh, basically, what we have is basically there are different. So the UN has this body called UNFC CC, which is basically United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Right. So what they have to do is these IPCC assessments that we talked about are basically things that they basically carry out. Then they have these different emission scenario series, which they basically used to predict future climate and so on and so forth. And basically, they also have these what do you say, COPs, which is basically so the parties or the countries which basically are part of this UNFCCC are basically called parties to the parties, and basically COP stands for Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So basically, it's the global forum where all such different countries gather to confront climate crisis, and basically the delegates and all discuss about what things they need to do and set goals. Right. So there have been basically a lot of these COP meetings and climate talks, and basically there have been quite a few highs and quite a few lows. For example, in Kyoto, what happened was developed nations that represent about half of global emissions pledged to reduce their climate pollution. Then again in 2015, in Paris Convention, what happened is Conference, what happened is 195 countries on the EU pledged to cut emissions with the goal of limiting global warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius. And in 2021, in Glasgow, countries are expected to pledge new climate targets, right? Which are much more ambitious in Paris. So this is what are the emissions that are required for Paris. So the reductions that we need, but the dotted line is basically where we are heading towards. Right. We need a reduction. So the red lines basically tell us if you want to keep the global warming limited to 2 degrees Celsius, then we need to follow the red line or be within the red line. And if we want it to be less than 1.5 degrees centigrade, we need to follow the blue line or be below the blue line. Right. So to deal with climate change, there are basically two kinds of things that we can do. One is climate change mitigation, where basically uh, we carry out actions to avoid and or reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Right. Mm. And whereas when we are talking about climate change adaptations, we are basically doing actions to adjust to the current or future consequences of climate change. Right. So mitigation is where we are trying to deal with climate change and trying to reduce emissions and so on and so forth. Adaptation is where we are like, okay, this is increasing, so we need to. So currently, the climate change has led to a 1 degree rise in the temperature of the globe. Then how do we deal with that, right? So that is climate change adaptations. So there are two ways to think about it, right? Then there are basically these different places, different data sets, where basically you can go and you can see how climate change affects extreme weather around the world. So climate change has basically led to increased occurrences of things like droughts or cyclones all across the globe, right? And basically, if we track this trend around our country, we see that basically uh, some parts of India are getting hotter, especially parts such as Rajasthan, Gujarat, and the northeast or basically southern states, right? Mm. So these parts of India are getting hotter, and other parts of India either maintaining the temperature or getting slightly cooler. But you see that this thing, even this rise in temperature is not very evenly distributed across the country, right? And now, if we look at basically how many districts in India are basically vulnerable to climate change, it can be very negatively affected due to climate change. We see that in that also there's a very different, very uh, what do you say? uh, is distinct pattern where basically we see all these red areas which are very vulnerable versus all these green areas in other different parts of the country where it is less vulnerable. Right. Then here we basically again it shows climate change projections and impact and basically what will happen on the coast. Right. So uh, these are like telling the occurrences of cyclone in this region, how it is increasing over the years, right? And basically how the sea level is increasing and how that will affect different lengths, different areas, right? Then, so this was it for the second lecture. In the third lecture, we started looking at uh, warming effects on the biosphere at three different scales. So the first thing was global scale, where we talked about range extension or phenology change, or basically which basically talks about when animals or birds are getting active, that change in that time. Then so they're generally active at a specific time of the day, or they do things at a specific time of the day. For example, birds generally have this thing called the dawn chorus, where they start vocalizing early in the morning, a lot of different birds. Right. If you live near birds, you might have heard about it. You might have heard dawn chorus early in the morning, right? So basically, phenology is basically changing in the time of that, or basically, if we look at plants when things are flowering, right? So the flowering season and so on and so forth, change in the flowering season for pollinators, change in the time of laying eggs and so on and so forth, right? And the third thing is forest dieback, which is basically we'll talk about it, right? Then we can look at the ecosystem scale. So all these scales are slightly interchangeable, so we can still look at all these different things from these different scales. But basically, what at the ecosystem scale, what we look at is we look at the examples of coral reefs and the spread of Lantana camara and how they affect ecosystems as a whole. Then at the individual level, we are looking at what are the physiological effects that different species might have due because of warming. Right. Does anyone have any doubts? Yeah. Continue in 2 minutes. Yeah, hi. Uh, so we'll continue with, if no one has any questions, we'll continue with this. We'll just check the chat. Right. So climate change is the primary driver of biodiversity loss, and climate change depends on biodiversity as part of the solution. So basically, the two of them are interlinked and cannot be separated. About like one third of the greenhouse gas emissions reduction are needed in the next decade. That can be achieved by improving the nature's ability to absorb these emissions. So basically, planting trees, right, which can get rid of this carbon dioxide. So what people have done here is basically we are looking at the effects of warming on different things. So here what we are seeing is how climate change causes geographical shifts in plant and animal distribution. Right. So here in a study conducted in the Himalayan alpine flora in the regions of Tibet, what they uh, saw is basically over 7 years, the alpine vegetation increased in number of species and frequency and in diversity. Right. Unexpectedly, the Himalayan endemic species also increased on the higher elevation summits. Right. So what they basically found is basically that mm what is it? Mm, what is happening is basically these vegetation is increasing because other plants from down below are basically climbing up and coming here. And the plants which are endemic to this region basically are going to the top of the hills, right? Because there's been warming and the top of the top areas are basically colder than the lower areas, which are basically more hotter. Right. So because of that, what they are doing is basically trying to move up. And because of that, endemic species which already lived in the foot of the Himalayas, they started going up. Right. So this is basically talking about that there are geographical shifts in plant and animal distributions that are caused by climate change. Right. Then there's another research that's carried out in ISC by Professor Umesh Srinivasan. where basically they have these long-term monitoring programs for birds of Eastern Himalayas, particularly in the areas of Arunachal Pradesh. So what they do is they look at how climate change and habitat degradation is affecting these bird populations, and they basically show that the patterns they see are consistent with upslope range shifts. So basically, these birds are basically moving up the slope as Earth is getting warmer and warmer, right? And they show that species with mm, elevational ranges below hotspot elevations show increases in the occurrence probability over time, and those with most of their elevational ranges above a hotspot decline in occurrence probability. Right. So what they're basically saying is they are going up, and once there's less area to go up to, then basically these are declining. Right, these species. So they are almost getting more and more difficult to say. They are getting more and more extinct. The other thing is body size is getting smaller. So basically, if you're an animal and you basically have smaller body size, so what you have is more surface area compared to the volume that you have. So what happens is basically your body is much easier to cool because of that. Because you have more surface area and uh, so the ratio of surface area to volume changes. Right. So what is happening here is basically because it is getting warmer and warmer, to stay cooler, the body size of these different animals is getting smaller and smaller. Right. So yeah, so the third point is basically what I was talking about, that the rapid upslope shift that are present may prove to be a problem for these mountain species. So basically species from the mountains, because what happens is, as we talked about before also, the endemic species are climbing to the top of the mountains, and once they run out of area, what to do? Right. Or basically because more and more species are getting concentrated in the smaller areas, there's more and more competition among them for the same resources. Right. So that also starts affecting things as well. Right. So, what people have showed is basically animals and plants are shifting their spatial distribution to track their climate niche. So, as the climate change basically increases and decreases various factors such as temperature, precipitation across the globe, what is happening is basically the climate niche of different organisms are shifting geographically. So, their spatial distribution is also shifting to track these changes in their climate niche. Right. Then we have elevational shifts for mountain species. So they are moving up the slopes instead of like moving from one geographical region to another, right? So they are more moving up the slopes, and because of that, it might lead to more extinctions for them. And then other things such as habitat change is also important in deciding the level of change in these different what do you say, species distributions, because many times what we do is we change the habitat, or we, because of land use change, or basically uh, construction of roads or other things, what is happening is basically we are contributing to a lot of change, and that also often affects the distribution ranges of these species. Right. The second global change that we see because of climate change is basically changes in phenology. So basically, phenology is the timing of annual or actually periodic cycles in plants and animals, right? And it is extremely sensitive to changes in climate. So, for example, things such as when a plant is flowering, when a plant is fruiting, when basically an animal is laying an egg, for example, an insect when they are laying an egg, right? Or when turtles lay an egg, things like that. So basically, those kinds of things are very sensitive. When birds call, things like that are very sensitive to environmental factors. And because there's a change in environmental factors such as temperature and precipitation and so on and so forth across time, what is happening is basically this phenology is also getting disturbed. So the timing of flowering, of fruiting, and basically senescence basically either shift left or right, or basically they increase. Some of these things, some of these effects basically get prolonged or get lesser, right? So these are basically phenological effects. So one example of that is basically um, so there's basically a study which basically shows that So cherry blossom is a national phenomenon in Japan where they have a lot of these different trees, right? So basically, what they have tracked is across the years, let's say from 1800s to 2000, they have tracked basically when is the peak of cherry blossom bloom in Kyoto. And basically, what they found out is that the peak is slowly and slowly basically reducing, right? So what is happening is the peak, which is basically the number of days after the start of the year when basically you see the peak, that is basically reducing. So the peak is coming earlier and earlier, right? So that is the influence of climate warming on the flowering phenology of uh, these cherry blossoms, right? So the other thing is basically uh, Yes. People also looked at basically trees and they basically see these phenological changes of basically changes when they are basically fruiting, when they are flowering, and when they have leaves. So basically, these changes are also shifting over time. Right. So here, what they are showing is basically uh, what these researchers have tried to do in, I think, in Tibet is so basically they have done is basically they have these large areas. So some areas they are basically artificially heating or warming by putting a rod in the soil that heats up the ground. Right. So what they are seeing is basically the one that is controlled or ambient versus the one that is warming. How are different things changing? So they see that the plant growth activity is almost similar in both of them. Right. So there's no effect of soil warming on plant growth activity. Whereas if you look at the microbial activity, you see that there's a higher microbial activity when there is warming, and that is actually pretty so that makes a lot of sense because we can, of course, have like higher peaks of activity because temperatures are getting higher and reaction is getting faster, right? And then again, when you see, look at basically the growing season for insects, for fauna, what is happening is that the due to warming, there's a slight mismatch here. And what basically is happening is that the fauna, instead of growing around August, instead of uh, yeah, flourishing around August, they're basically increasing a lot during June and then dropping off. Right. So this can lead to mismatch between the phenology of these fauna, these insects, and basically the plant community that is present there. Right. Technology mismatch such as that can lead to drastic changes, such as the timing of seasonal activities, such as timing of flowering or breeding of many plant and animal species has advanced. A limited period in the year when conditions are favorable enough to be successful or reproduce or grow, right? So basically, the period of time when you are able to grow and reproduce also starts decreasing, right? Because let's say there's uh, pollinator, let's say a bee or something, a wasp, which needs to lay an egg in a fig plant, right? We talked about a fig and fig wasp. So let's say we have a fig, which basically, fig wasp, which basically needs to lay its egg on a fig plant, right? But what is happening is the fig plant is uh, basically uh, flowering later, right? And the uh, fig wasp is starting to lay eggs earlier. So there's a mismatch because of change in the temperature, right? And because of that, what can happen is basically there might be trophic decoupling, right? So there might be both these species might be lost because these two species are co-evolved to become like strong selectors for each other. So what will happen is basically they both may die off, and then basically the amount of favorable time that is present when both of them are in the perfect state also slowly decreases over time, right? So that can lead to large fitness consequences and so on and so forth, right? So uh, here basically what they show is the great tet is a bird, and basically the caterpillar biomass is basically what they're basically eating. So what we see is across the years, the caterpillar biomass has been decreasing, the peat has been decreasing, right? Whereas the great tits are not that affected by it, right? So the uh, based on that, the amount of food that they get will also change, right? Then we have these pest infestations, and basically now we see that there are new kinds of pests. Uh, uh, yeah, basically what we know about insects and how they're affected by climate is mostly from studying pests, but what we are trying to do is generalize from that to different groups of insects. And what we are basically finding here is that increasing temperature affects insect pests in different ways. So what happens is basically there's increased number of generations in these because basically the life cycle gets faster and faster. And then we have the expansion of geographic range because of heating, and then we basically have things such as desynchronization of insect and their natural enemies, or basically loss of synchrony with their host plants. Mm, And here on the right hand side, we can see a flow chart where basically it shows how change in temperature or rise in temperature and changes in rainfall patterns, how they basically directly and indirectly affect insects. Right. Then here we see basically uh, what is called as forest dieback, right? So basically, forest dieback is basically when these, what do you say? Uh, there's a lot of death of these forests because of hair incidences of things like drought and other climatic effects, right? Because of that, there's a lot of loss in a lot of forest area, and that is known as forest dieback, and that you can see in many different places. In India also, there's a point like that, right? Uh, so the other thing from India, where we have basically the Western Ghats, where we have these unique kind of life landscape, which is called the Shola grasslands, which are basically in the Nilgiri Mountains. Basically, they um, have these grassland patches, which are interwoven with basically forest patches also high on top of these mountains in the Western Ghats. So what basically happens here is frosting is a very critical time period for plant growth, and with warming there are less days when there is frost, and basically because of that it's affecting the whole ecosystem. Right. Next, we'll talk about ecosystem level changes such as ocean warming and coral reefs, how they are getting affected, and the spread of Lantana camara. Right. So uh, the map here on the right hand side, on the left hand side, basically shows us the location of the world's coral reefs, right? Where all they are present. Then uh, we basically have this representation of basically a coral polyp and an algae which lives on that. So the corals basically, uh, coral reefs, what they have is basically coral polyps, and basically there are algae that are living on that, which basically give them food, right? So the corals can create an extremely rich habitat, and the algae is basically what gives them color also, right? So they create an extremely rich habitat that can house a number of different species and basically provide protection for low-lying islands from lake waves and other things. Right. So Then we look at basically uh, coral bleaching, which is happening because of ocean acidification. So what is basically happening is the coral and the algae live in a symbiosis, and at higher temperatures or uh, yeah, ocean heating up for global warming. So at higher temperatures, what is happening is basically the amount of reactive oxygen increases, and the coral starts to kick out the algae from the symbiosis, right? And the corals can survive a bleaching event, but they are under more stress and they are subject to more mortality because the algae are not there anymore, right? So what we see here is basically where all coral bleaching has occurred. So what is the probability? Highest probability, lower probability. We see that the highest probability is around the tropical mid latitudes, which are around 15 to 20 degrees north, which is the belt between 15 to 20 degrees north and 15 to 20 degrees south, right? Including the equator. And despite similar thermal stress that is present at equator, temperature doesn't seem to be the only driving effect of bleaching, right? There are other effects also. So then again, you have basically from India. India, we have places like, for example, this is Lakshadweep, Kavaratti Atoll, which is one of the islands in Lakshadweep, basically where they have these corals, and we see that there are three recorded instances of coral bleach in Lakshadweep. So it has happened in 1998, then again in 2010, and basically again in 2016. So on the left hand side, we see a graph of basically what is called the temperature and the what is basically the what do you say uh, bleaching threshold. So if you cross this temperature, bleaching occurs, right? So and the graph basically shows us what is the change in temperature across the years, right? In 2016 and in 2010, and what we see is basically that in 2010 it slowly crossed the almost crossed the threshold, and because of that there was a bleaching effect. But in 2016 it has increased quite a lot, right? And some people basically think that the reef is more resilient because initially people thought that it would not recover after the 2010 bleaching, but and even a subsequent small shock could kill it. But 2016 there was a big shock and it did not wipe it off. Right. Then next we are basically looking at Lantana gamara. So this is an invasive plant that is basically found all across India. So what is happening is basically um, we are seeing how basically the what do you say? Lantana is growing and taking over a lot of the areas, right? And what we see is basically on the right hand side how things can be affected by this because lantana change leads to changes basically in the uh, what do you say? Secondary structure of the forest, so affecting forest. So basically here we see if the climate has changed, that forest is okay. What's going to happen if the climate and forest change, what happens? And if also it includes fire, what happens, right? These are the different scenarios according to the IPCC. Then again, we have basically the physiological effects of climate change. So for example, if you look at the marine fish, we have a fish called eel pout. So what is basically happening is basically we are looking at evidence of thermal constraints on oxygen transport, basically that is leading to population decline in Warden Sea, right? Uh, so basically, the population starts to decline before the temperature starts to threaten the survival of an individual, right? So what is happening basically is they try to take a look at it, and they initially thought that basically the cardiac output is basically the reason basically what do you say why they are probably dying off because after some time your physiological performance starts to decrease with temperature, right? Because you are very overstressed, right? So what they are shown is basically all these different graphs showing like what is the performance of the organism, what is the physiological performance, and so on and so forth. And basically, then they have what is known as the growth and reproduction. So basically, there's an optimal temperature and all that they need to basically grow and reproduce. If that temperature is not being reached, then that affects not only their survival as an adult, that also affects their growth and reproduction. And because of that, the population size has been decreasing, right? So the lower scope for growth and reproduction is what is leading to the population decline instead of basically the death due to heat induction in the individual, right, due to heat stroke kind of things. Right. So basically, the takeaway from here is that you don't need to have a large temperature rise to experience a sharp population decrease. Warming places stress on a lot of different places, a lot of different things, and basically little stresses on a cardiovascular system when we are young, for example, in this case, might be very little. Right. Then here again, we basically see that what do you say? In river ecosystems across Nepal, how basically this distribution of the snow trout change due to global warming, right? So what they're basically seeing is basically the dots are basically where they occur. The blue ones are basically where they're currently suitable, right? And basically we see that there are places where they used to occur, but they are not no longer currently suitable because of warming. Right. So we looked at all these three different kinds of effects of warming at the biosphere at all these three different scales, which is the global, the ecosystem, and the individual level. And now basically uh, we can try and basically look at a multifaceted way to protect biodiversity and how all these different facets of biodiversity drive change in biodiversity. For example, we can have basically, we can talk about species interactions and basically how interaction matrices can be used to predict novel communities. When we talk about evolution, where we basically uh, uh, can develop basically models to predict adaptive responses based on genes, right? When we talk about the environment, where we are basically trying to predict what happens due to land use change, then based on physiology, we can make predictions where we are basically talking about how individuals will respond physiologically. Then demographically, we can talk about how climate affects the demography of a population or the population dynamics of a population. Then we can talk about dispersal, where how climate also affects the dispersal behavior and to predict basically how spatially animals might be distributed more or less similar to each other. Right. So that was all from all these three lectures. Next, we'll talk about lecture 58, which was on biodiversity conservation. So this was a guest lecture where basically Krishna Priyatama, I think, talked about biodiversity. So basically, as you all know, the Earth is biodiverse. It has a lot of diversity, a lot of different kinds of flora and fauna. And specifically, biology, specifically ecology, allows us to look at these secrets of nature, and it also has a lot of different well-being implications for us and the whole planet. Right. So ecosystems are critical for our survival. So we live in an ecosystem, right? Every one of us lives in some kind of ecosystem. In different kinds of animals live in different kinds of ecosystem, and basically ecosystems are very critical for our survival and the survival of many different species on the earth, right? And basically, we have seen that human livelihoods and well-being is deeply integrated with the well-being of ecosystems. When you basically go to a uh, forested area or you go to a lake or a waterfall, you feel kind of fresh, you feel kind of good. Similarly, we have these different animals which go to ponds to take a bath and so on and so forth. So basically, all these different facets, different parts of the ecosystem need to be maintained because all of them are deeply integrated with us and with our well-being. Right. So the problem that we are trying to discuss here, or we are talking about here, is what are the threats to biodiversity that require conservation efforts. So conservation is in the sense that we are trying to conserve a given animal or a species. So what we are trying to do is we are trying to basically save that species from going extinct. Right. So basically, what are the threats to biodiversity that require conservation efforts? So there are many different threats to biodiversity and to ecosystems, such as habitat loss due to land use change and habitat degradation. So basically, when we are basically cutting down forests to basically agriculture or build, what do you say? uh, livelihood, place for our livelihood, things like that. What we are doing is basically we are leading to it's leading to habitat loss and land use change, and it's leading to habitat degradation. Then basically deforestation and habitat fragmentation, where we are making roads through forests or cutting down trees for other uses such as timber and so on and so forth. Then we have things such as human wildlife conflicts which are arising because of these, and we have invasive species which are taking over areas. Then we have climate change and we have poaching or wildlife trade and overexploitation. Right. So we'll talk about these slowly. So habitat conversion, loss and deforestation lead to fragmented landscapes. For example, here you can see basically um, a photo of what is happening. Um, so you see that basically all of this area was probably forest before, and now what is happening is these patches are basically agricultural lands that are what do you say? Uh, Basically, the forests have been cut down to make agricultural lands, right? So now what is happening is basically this habitat uh, destruction or conversion and deforestation is basically leading to fragmented landscape. So now there might be an animal which is present here on this area and it's not able to come here because there's no way for it, right? All of this goes through agriculture, and basically for a wild animal to cross an agricultural farm or cross a human inhabited area, it might not be very suitable for them. It might be very scary, very stressful. For example, if there's a highway and they are going, there may be vehicles which might basically just kill them, or basically someone catches them, poaches them, things like that, right? So it gets very difficult for them to travel from this area to the other. Whereas if all of it was a forest, it would have been much easier for the wildlife to move, right? The next thing is if you look at it, basically, because now we have these different agricultural areas, what is happening is here we have a boundary where human and animal conflict can happen. Again, here we have another boundary where human animal conflict can happen. Right. So the boundary is where human animal conflict, human wildlife conflict happens, increases with habitat loss, habitat fragmentation. Right. So what happens in this case is basically often there's like, for example, if we try to encroach upon an area where a tiger generally lives, then what will happen is basically slowly the tiger will start coming to this area because they are large animals that require a very large range and they cannot basically, what do you say, stay in smaller areas, so they'll try to come there, right? So what they'll do is they'll start coming, they'll start eating sheep, then we'll again retaliate, we might kill the tiger, and so on and so forth. So basically, there's this constant human wildlife conflict, not just tigers, but other animals also, which basically leads to either loss of life or loss of habitat or loss of other things. Right. Then there's the other thing, other issue of spread of invasive and non-native species. So what is happening is basically uh, for example, here is an article about Bandipur National Park, where basically they're talking that around 75% of the area is infested with this plant called lantana that we talked about, and the majority of the forest landscape has been changing. Right. And basically, what is happening is because these lantana, if you have seen it, it's good. If not, maybe go look at a photo. So this is one of the photos. So what happens is lantana is kind of like a shrub, and it basically keeps growing, right? So it basically tries to form these walls, sort of thing, because there's a lot of lantana, or it basically has a high density. So what happens is it increases the amount of leaves, amount of branches that are present in a given area, and it becomes difficult to move through that area, especially for wildlife. Right. Uh, so this is how they basically can affect movement of animals and other different things in the forest. Right. Then the thing is, all these different kinds of threats, such as habitat destruction, invasive species, and basically human-wildlife conflict, everything. All these threats occur simultaneously and not in isolation. So it's not like one will come and then the other will come. All of them occur simultaneously, can occur at the same time. Right. And because they are occurring at the same time, their impacts on wildlife might be very additive. Right. For example, a tiger might be involved with human-animal conflict, human conflict on some boundary area, but when it's going inside the forest, there might be a high amount of lantana and it's unable to move freely across in that area or look for food. Right. So these effects can be additive and they require a data-driven approach to basically predict what will happen and what will not happen. And basically conservation efforts should also be multidimensional in this regard to basically deal with all these threats at the same time. Right. So now we'll examine three ways in which biology helps us obtain information about organisms and ecosystems, the threats they face, and how they respond to these changes in the environment. So the first thing is estimating the and monitoring population sizes of organisms. So scientists use various methods such to estimate population size of plants and animals. And basically, for example, here someone is probably bird watching, right? So counting the number of individuals they are seeing from a given spot, right? So this provides us a baseline data on how many individuals and whether population numbers are decreasing over time. So if we try to do that across time for the same species in the given area, we can see if it's increasing or decreasing over time in that given region, right? So here basically a researcher is counting the number of birds that use a particular habitat. Right? We can see how basically are birds shifting their pattern of habitat use, some of the birds going away from the habitat and so on and so forth. Right. So the second thing is mapping landscapes and habitats. So using satellite and remotely sensed data to map ecosystems and to monitor change. So this basically is a satellite image showing forest fires that are occurring in basically Idaho in USA. And you see that the amount or the kind of data that we have here, the basically spatial coverage of the data. Right. So there's a huge area in which they are basically showing it on the map of how the forest is burning. But if you were to basically go and on land, basically go and collect data on where all forest fires are happening, it might be, it might not even be possible. Right? It's a challenging task, and it might not even be possible. But using satellite imagery and other remote sensing data, we are able to map these ecosystems and monitor their change in real time across a larger area. Right? Then we have conservation genetics, which reveals the secrets of population. So basically, by using genetic data, we can not only estimate the population size, but also see where this population came about, where it is going, or is it like mixing with these populations, other populations, which are migrating where, and so on and so forth. So, for example, here they are showing what do you say, using genetic data. They are basically showing the network of areas. So basically for tigers, what is their demographic history? How connected are they and so on and so forth. And basically the map shows the areas that are designated for protection of tigers in the country because these are lake corridors and forest areas where basically these tigers are roaming around or they basically cross from one population to the another or migrate, right, to maintain their gene pool. Let's take a brief look at the history of biodiversity conservation and the various initiatives taken towards biodiversity conservation in the country. Right. So the first thing is in pre-colonial India as well. So in pre-colonial India, kings and princes hunted as a sport. Like for example, people would go out hunting tigers or lions and so on and so forth. The British, however, when they came in colonial India, they basically started to exterminate different species such as tigers and so on and so forth by basically rewarding people, rewarding poachers for killing them and so on and so forth. So what they did is they basically bounty hunted these animals and that led to a large decrease in their population sizes, right? The other thing is there was a lot of tree felling and forest lost in many parts of the country to basically clear out paths for the railways so that they can carry coal and also to convert areas into agriculture so that they can support themselves. Right? colonizers, the British people, not us. Right. So after independence, the forest department continued both basically by protecting and extracting the resources, and people were talking about how nature and environment are declining, and basically in the 1960s, 1970s, Salim Ali, M. Krishnan, and other people started raising their voice and sounding alarms on the decline of these large number of species. In 1970s, people started to note that tigers, gharials, and other populations were declining quite a lot. And Indira Gandhi, who was herself a nature enthusiast, was willing to consider protection of nature. Right. And there were other environmental movements that shaped people's attitude towards biodiversity conservation. For example, the two important movements that we talk about are basically the Chipko movements, where basically you see these women trying to hug a tree so that the tree cannot be cut down, right? And then we have the Silent Valley movement, where basically the dam project, right, that we talked about before. Then wildlife protection in India is enforced by the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972, right? So if you read the first paragraph, the preamble of this act, what it says is, it is an act to provide for the conservation and protection and management of wildlife, and for matters connected therewith or ancillary or incidental thereto, with a view to ensuring the ecological and environmental security of the country. Right. So any matter concerning things such as conservation, protection, and management of wildlife, uh, with or ensuring an overview of ecological and environmental security for the country, they are this act is supposed to cover. Right. So this act was put in response to declines in population of many wild species, including the tiger and the great Indian bustard. Then the government of India basically passed this in 1972, then brought wildlife conservation into concurrence list. It was earlier in basically the state list. And then we have basically wildlife boards and standing committees, including a state level committee that is chaired by the CM. Right. So, based on that, they have basically taken a call and decided various protected areas that are present in India, including different national parks, different wildlife sanctuaries, conservation reserves, community reserves, and also marine protected areas. We have marine national parks such as the Mahatma Gandhi National Park, right? And also there are areas of conservation importance called Ramsar sites, right? So another thing that we can do is basically restoring the habitat in places where the habitat has been disturbed. So restoring and reforestation or afforestation of habitats based on ecological data. So what is basically what uh, so habitat loss and degradation is a major threat to biodiversity. And what we can do is basically restore and reforest areas that were earlier forests. Then we can use ecological data to basically provide critical data on what trees need to be planted, where it need to be planted, and so on and so forth. And we can use that to restore habitats such as forests and grasslands. Right. So here are some successes of projects that are implemented by the government. For example, Project Tiger has made progress. So around 1970s, there were around 1,500 tigers all across India, but as of 2023, the reported number is around 3,682. So it has increased from around 1,500 to around 4,000 today. And India now boasts of the largest population of wild tigers that are present in the world. Right. So mm, what has happened is basically we are able to accurately estimate the population size of the tigers because we are getting more and more better with developing technologies such as camera traps and so on that are used now. Right. Then basically tigers are mapped in their habitat so that we can have better conservation plans based on where they go, how they move, and so on and so forth. And then we have conservation genetics studies which have helped us understand how different populations are connected and which can be used to identify corridors for movement and save these corridors. Right. However, there are species such as the great Indian bustard which are declining in population size. Forest loss continues for various reasons, and there's a lot of climate change that is happening. Then we need basically local communities which need to step forward and basically take part in conservation. Right. biodiverse ecosystems are critical to our well-being, and biology basically helps us understand the natural world by the application of various different kinds of techniques and approaches, and basically biodiversity conservation in India. So these are the three different things that we'll talk about next. So mm, biology, specifically the study of ecosystems and wildlife, has implications in our own well-being. As we all know, that biological conservation requires us to apply our knowledge of ecological systems to ensure their long-term persistence. As scientists, our work can provide crucial data on the state of our biodiversity. Right. So that was it for the last lecture. Um, we'll move on to the practice assignment. So the first question is, range shifts in plants and animals are happening at global scale. This means species are competing with new species in the environment. Species are reorganizing their climate niche and moving to areas they were not found before. Both A and B, D, none of the above. So the answer here is B. Sorry, C, both A and B. So the species are competing with new species in the environment because new species are coming into the environment because of changes, and species are reorganizing their climate niche and moving to areas that they were not found before because their climate niche is moving. The second question is, the indicators of global warming can be viewed at three scales, dash, dash, and dash. So the answer is global, ecosystem, and individual, as we talked about right now. A mismatch in physiological changes can lead to A, biodiversity redistribution, B, global warming, C, changes in summer temperature, D, none of the above. The answer here will be D, none of the above. Okay. Mismatch in physiological changes cannot lead to biodiversity redistribution or global warming. Global warming is the reason why we see physiological changes, and changes in summer temperatures are also due to global warming. Right. The Keeling curve shows us a significant pattern of a steady rise in atmospheric temperature, steady rise in atmospheric carbon dioxide, steady rise in precipitation, all of the above. The answer here is a steady rise in carbon dioxide. So the thing that I forgot when we were talking about all these is that this graph that we saw was basically called the Keeling curve because this was plotted by a scientist called Keeling. Right. So now we talk about the Keeling curve, and it shows us basically a steady rise in atmospheric carbon dioxide over the years. Forest diebacks are incidents of forest tree mortality that occur owing to trees being exposed to long-term droughts, trees becoming more vulnerable to insect pests. C, both A and B. D, none of the above. Right. So the answer here is C, both A and B. So forest tiebacks are incidences of forestry mortality that are occurring because of long-term droughts and more vulnerable to insect pests that is occurring because of global warming. That was it for today. Uh, if no one has any questions, we continue with this on next week. Okay. So we'll continue next week and we'll discuss about the last week. Thank you for attending. I'll see you guys next week.